Hi everyone, welcome to part 2. So this part we're actually going to start laying out the data in our UI. Now before we actually get to the UI part, we need to think about state, how we want our data to be accessed. In theory, we could build a screen that just on load, if it was a stateful component, could call this list endpoint and then update its state and display it. But that means every time you would go to that screen, it would be calling it again, and it's just not the proper way to do things when you want to have something more global. And you know, our games, they might exist on many screens. So state management is essentially the concept of managing the state of your application, and it's probably the most complex part of software development in any language, any framework. It really is app development at the end of the day. You know, a lot of people can come in and learn a bit about Flutter and make some nice UI and make it pretty, but actually getting the data to do what you want and modify it as you want is where the real work comes in. Luckily, there's some great state management packages, and I haven't used all of them because there's a new one every week, but I've used some of the biggest ones, and riverpod is my favorite. So we're gonna get that set up. So first thing I need to do, we've already installed riverpod in the last version, but we do need to go to our main.dart, and we need to wrap our my app in a provider scope. And this means that riverpod state will have access to anything below this in the tree, and this is the very top of the tree, so we can use it. And now we're going to go to our providers folder, which is currently empty, and we're going to make something called a game list provider. And this is going to manage the state of our game list, so all the games that are, you know, essentially in our database. All right, so we'll make that. And we are going to start by creating it. So it's going to be called game list provider. And we're going to extend something called state notifier, which is built into riverpod. So you'll see it imported riverpod there. And what we need to do is tell it through a generic what kind of state this will be managing. And in this case, it's going to be a list of that game model that we made. And let's just get that imported. There we go. Okay. And then what we need to do is actually instantiate it. So we do the constructor, game list provider. And when this thing is first initialized, we need to set its initial state. And in this case, we'll just use an empty list because we don't actually have the data yet, but we want it to conform to the contract here, saying that this will have a list of games, and an empty list is technically a list of games. So we'll start with that. And then we want to actually make the singleton that we're going to be accessing through our UI. So we'll just call this the same thing, except in camel case, game list provider, and we're going to be making it equal to a state notifier provider. And in here, we have to set the generic to what provider we're referencing, as well as, again, the state. So we just put those there. And then what we want to do from here is actually just return an instance of this class. Okay, now what we want to do here, oh, I missed a semicolon, let's get that in there. We're going to make a load function that essentially talks to our service and gets the data. So this will be async, meaning it's going to be a future, but it's not actually going to return anything. It's just going to return nothing, void. But what we want to do here is actually, we'll go final response equals await, and we'll import our game service. And here we just run that .list function, which in the last video we wrote out, which returns, you know, a either, because we're using fpdart for functional programming. So we're either going to get a string back, meaning it was an error, and the string will be the error message, or we're actually getting a list of games back, which is great because that's what we want here. So now what we can do is we can take the response and we can fold it like we've done previously. And I like to just name these what they really are. So this would be an error, and in this case I'm just going to print error. Now in a real application you'd probably want to handle this differently and, you know, show some kind of message, but that's out of the scope of this tutorial. Now when it is right, meaning we got something back, I'm just going to call it games because you'll see this is a list of games. Now in here all we have to do is we just go state equals games. So in riverpod, that's actually just how you update the state. You'll see state, this isn't a variable we made. It's actually something that's just part of what we're extending, the state notifier. You'll see there's state here, this dot state. And when we set it, it does all this stuff under the hood to notify and do the rebuilds. So if you use provider, it's kind of similar, except in provider you would also have to run notify listeners. Here we don't, because anytime this state changes, we get this. Now with riverpod in general, we never can mutate state. We can't just be like state state.add and then pass in like a single game. State always has to be completely replaced with something new. So that's just something in general, and just I wanted to point out. Okay, so we have our load function, and the last thing I want to do is in the initialization function of this, we just want to call that load function. So anytime the UI starts to talk to this for the first time, if it hasn't actually been instantiated yet, it'll get instantiated, and then it'll run load. So we don't actually have to like load it and then call this load function in our UI. We just want it to kind of happen. So there's our list provider. Yay! So similarly, we're going to want a detail provider. So I'm going to make that. We'll just call it game detail provider. And this is meant for just making an API request to get a single response. So this is a little bit different, and it's a lot simpler too. So what we're going to do is we're going to make something just called final game detail provider. So instead of like creating, like we did over here, a whole class and stuff to manage this, this is a lot simpler. So we're actually just going to create what's called a future provider. And if we look at this, this is part of Flutter riverpod as well. And we actually want to use what's called a family. Now a family allows us to actually, instead of this being a singleton, it's multiple singletons. We can actually have a reference to it based on an identifier. So what we have to do first is say what kind of state this is. And in this case, it's not a list of games, it's a single game, but it could be null, right? Something could go wrong. It maybe was a 404 error. So we want to say that in theory, this won't always return a game. It could return null. And then the second parameter, and this is when you're using a family, you have to say what type of primitive are we using for the family. In this case, it's going to be the string. So we're going to use the ID of the game, which happens to be a string in our model. And over here now, we have ref, and then we actually have ID. That's the ID of the game. You'll see it's a string because we've said it's a string here. And over here, let's just make this like this. And this is going to be an async function, because what we need to do first is actually do the result. So result equals await, and we'll just do game service and dot retrieve. And then we can pass in that ID, which will be passed in when we create this, as you'll see. And again, this, because we're using functional programming, this isn't actually the game itself. This could be an error message, or it could be the game. So in this case, I'm going to do return result.fold. So again, the first thing might be, and sometimes if you get the autocomplete, it actually kind of makes your life a little bit easier. So we know that this will be error. And in this case, I'm just going to print error. And then actually, we can't return printing error, so we'll just make it not a arrow function and just print the error. And then after, we'll return null just to conform to the contract, because we said it will be returning either a game or a null. And in the case that it was a success, it will be a game, as you'll see here, game. And here we just return the game itself. There we go. So now when we're calling in reference to our game detail provider with a particular ID, it will return a future of that, and we'll see how that works when we get to the UI part. Okay, let's do some UI. So it's funny, we're I don't know, not quite an hour, but quite a bit into this tutorial, and I haven't even tried to run this app because we've just been sort of building the underlying architecture to manage the networking, and now we've just got started on managing the state. But we're about to actually do some UI. So what we'll start with is we're going to make a component, and it's just going to be called GameList.dart. And this isn't a screen, it's just the actual like list itself that will it'll show up in a screen, but we'll get there. So what I'm going to do is we're going to just use this nice little shorthand STL, which will let us have a stateless widget. Yay, and we will call this GameList. Now, what I'm going to do is, instead of a stateless widget, we're actually going to change this to a consumer widget. And this is built into riverpod. And what it allows us to do is get access to our state, anything below that provider scope that we added in our main.dart. So I now have to make one change to my build, because the build function that we're overriding in consumer widget is a little bit different than stateless widget. It has one extra parameter, and it's a widget ref, which we'll just call ref by convention. And that allows us to, watch our providers for changes, modify, access our notifiers, all that kind of stuff. So in here, what we can actually do is we can go final games equal, and we do ref.watch. We actually want to watch, so if something changes, this rebuilds, and we're specifically watching the game list provider. And again, that was this provider here that goes and gets the data and sets its state. So we're watching essentially the state to change. Then what I want to actually return is a list view.builder. And our item builder, we'll just start with context and index and put this like this. But we need to make sure that we set a count on this. So item count is going to be just games.length. Now inside here, we're going to get access to the specific game by looking at those games here and getting the one at this index, because this will run for however many there are in here, and we're getting the index starting at 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. So each row in this list will be a game. And here, just to kind of like make sure stuff's working, let's just take the game and do .name. Okay, so before we get too far into that, let's make our game list screen, which is essentially our home screen in this tutorial. Game list screen, and let's just make stateless widget, game list screen. And our game list screen is going to return a scaffold because it's a screen. So that, and we can have just a simple app bar that just says, title, text, my games. And the body itself, we're actually just going to use that game list that we just made. All right, now let's boot this up and see if it works. So I have it set to Mac OS. I'm just going to go to my main.dart, and I'm just going to click this run function here. It's a good chance I missed something tying this all together, as this has kind of been, blind coding, which is just a fun thing to do sometimes. You build a lot. I don't recommend it for all the time, but it can be pretty fun to just try and build as much as you can before you even launch it, and we'll see. I boot it up, and we have a black screen, and I can tell you exactly what we want. The one thing we forgot, let's go to our main.dart. And let's make sure we set that home to our game list screen. Not the list itself, but the screen. And let's just save that. And there we have it. We have our app bar with my games, and then we have the games like this. So let's take a moment just to kind of step through, now that we finally have UI, let's step through exactly what is happening here. So this is our main app, and we have provider scope wrapped around it, which we need for riverpod. And we just have a basic material app. And we're saying, hey, the home is game list screen. So in our game list screen, we have just a basic scaffold, and it has this thing called game list. Game list is watching our game list provider. So we'll look at that. When game list provider is instantiated, it runs this load function. Our load function goes off and ultimately calls this, and will update the state that is being watched. And if we look at this function again, we'll see what we do is we run our get function, and the get function ultimately goes and runs this handle function built into our base service, which is using DO, and we switch through here and get to the get, and it just calls that using the options, which is this base URL, and as well as application type of or content type of application JSON, and we pass it along, and it gets returned back as a success, meaning through write, because this is an either. And if something went wrong, it would return that error message as a string. And then back in here, we just got that data, and if it was left, we have the error, and we kind of pass that error through to the next thing. But when it is correct, we just take all of our data that's come back, we loop through it, and we use our game.fromJSON. And our game model is just this pretty basic freezed model that has the shape of our data and has some nice overrides for things like when the API has it in underscore format, or snake case as it's called, but we want it in camel case. So that's everything that's happening there just to generate this on the screen. Let's go back to our game list and let's make it a little bit prettier. So what I'd like to do, I'm going to extract this widget, which I know is a silly widget to extract. It's kind of just a text, but you'll see why this makes it a little bit easier. And we'll call this game list tile. And I just like to personally have the properties on top. So I just like to do that. And I'm going to take this and I'm actually just going to make a new file called game list tile.dart and paste in just that same stuff and make sure we import in the things we need, material, and we need to import our game model. And we go back to this and we make sure we import it. So that just allows us to have this game list tile as its own file, which is a nice way to do it. Now our game list tile, I actually don't want to just have it as text. Let's actually return a list tile. And we'll actually wrap this list tile in a card just to give it a little bit of prettiness. And let's do some things. Let's have a title, which would be game.name. We can have a subtitle of game.console. And let's just see how that looks real quick. Oh, we didn't save a file, so it's confused. There we go. So it's looking a little bit prettier now. And I'm just going to add a trailing comma there. Then what we're going to do is just add a leading image. So this basically is just an image.network. Now in a real app, I would use cached network image for this because technically every time we come into this screen, if we had like tabs or something, it would be re-downloading those images. Cached network image is awesome, but no need to go into that for this tutorial. So we just have this lovely network image, which now puts these here and stuff like that. We'll also just add a icon in the trailing so that it looks like you can click on it. And then we're going to have an on tap event, but we will just leave that one empty for now. But simply having it at least gives you the mouse over effect, and it doesn't do anything, but it's there. Okay, so that kind of deals with our list, and it's great. And even if we rebuild, we'll see them sort of come back in there, and everything is working as we want. Next, let's deal with the detail screen. Now we could just make a screen, and just do a material page route and pass that game over to it, and everything's great. And that would be fine in most use cases. However, there's two reasons why I prefer this other approach. One, if this is going to be something for Flutter Web, we could expect that someone could just copy a URL of the detail screen and paste it to someone, and they click, and coming just to that screen on its own, there won't be any context because you never came and it never was able to pass the whole game through. So what I'd prefer to do, and we're not going to be dealing with setting up routing or anything like this for this tutorial, but what I like to do is I just want to pass the smallest amount of data over to the screen. In that case, it'll be the ID of the game, and the screen itself will be the thing that goes and resolves that. That way, when someone just clicks on it from a deep link, it handles it all on its own, and it doesn't need to know the context of the previous screen. So that's what we're going to do here. And so we'll start by let's make the screen. So we're going to have something called game detail screen.dart, and we'll start by making this a stateless widget, game detail screen. Now, similarly, we also want to use the consumer widget here. And in here, we're going to go and just update this to use that. Okay, now the way we want this to work is, so not in, like I was saying before, if we wanted to do it kind of what I'd say the bad way, we would just allow game to be passed in and as part of the constructor here, and it would have all the game data and everything is good. But for the reason I just mentioned, as well as the reason that sometimes in an API you have different data in the list view as a detail API request. Sometimes if there's a lot of data, the list endpoint only sends back like the things you need, the very the ID and the title and maybe the thumbnail and a few other things, whereas the detail view might have a lot more. So we don't want to rely on that data. We want to we want to get the data ourselves. So instead of passing in a game, we're just going to be passing in a game ID as a string. And we'll just make that required, this .game ID. Now, what we can do here is we can go final data equals ref.watch. Instead of watching the list provider, we're going to watch that detail provider now. Now, because this is a family, this is where we actually pass in the parameter that is denoting that particular instance of the family. So we go game detail provider and pass in game ID. Luckily that all worked out because we planned it well. It's a string and this is a string. So now we have that. Now what is this though? This is an async value game question mark. Okay, interesting. How do we work with that? So first of all, let's just get a scaffold going because this is a screen. And we won't worry about the app bar yet, but let's worry about the body. And in here, what we're actually going to be returning is we want to take that data and we can run something called when on it. And when is basically handling all the different cases that the data state could be in. For instance, it could still be loading. What do we want to do when the data is still loading? An error could have come back. What do we want to do in that case? Or data might have actually come back, and how do we want to handle that? So we'll start with this. We'll work backwards because loading is pretty easy. So this is a function we just need to pass in, and really what we want to return here is a circular progress indicator, just one of the built-in little spinners, and I'm actually just going to wrap this in a center. So that's what will happen when it's loading. Let's just add some guys here. Now for error, similarly, we're just going to maybe return like center with text, with a child of text, and here we'd want to pass in the error. Now error, loading has no parameters. Error has two. The first will be the error itself, and the second will be a stack trace. In the UI, we don't care at all about the stack trace because we're not going to show our users a stack trace. That would be silly. But what we can do is we can just use an underbar here to kind of be like, we don't really care about using this. But we have this object that's the error, so we can just go e.toString. So this will show, in the middle of the screen what the error is. Cool. That works for my case right now. Data, on the other hand, has one parameter, and it's actually the game itself. And in here, because I'm going to do a little more, I'm not going to use the arrow function. But technically this can be a null game, right? Like it could have 404 and not found anything. So we can go if game equals null, maybe we just return, text that says game not found or something like that. And similarly, maybe we want this on the center of the screen, we'll wrap it in the center. However, if it is found, let's just return something for now temporarily that just is like game.name. And let's just start with that. Okay, so now we just need to make it so we can click to go here. So we're going to go to our list tile here, and we're just going to do nothing fancy happening here. We're just going to essentially do a navigator of context.push. Obviously, we're using a routing library. We do this a little bit differently, but we're not doing that. So, and then we just have to, point to the game detail screen and pass in the game ID. So let's see if that all works. So I'm going to click on StarCraft, and there we go. We have StarCraft. Now a bit of a problem here. I can't really get out of this anymore. Oh, I can if I drag. Okay, we're good. That's great UX. I think we're done. We can make it better though. Okay, so that part's working. Now let's deal with the app bar. So I'm just going to copy something just because it's very similar to what we were doing before, and I'll walk you through it. Okay, so here similar to body, we're doing something for the app bar too. So we're basically going, okay, when we have the data, we're going to pass in an app bar with, assuming there's a name, we will put it there. Otherwise, it'll just fall back to not found because game, again, might be null. If there's an error, we'll just put error in and then when it's loading, I still want the app bar to be there to like take up the space that it needs to, so that stuff doesn't shift around, but I don't necessarily need like any text in it. And I mean, this API is pretty fast, so I don't think we'll even notice it. So now we actually have, this app bar, and you'll see it kind of like, if you're looking really fast, it's kind of blank for a second. Now, if I go to it a second time, what's cool, it's not actually making an API request because we've already instantiated that version for name 44. and it's not actually calling again. But if I go to one that we haven't, you'll see it kind of flashes. Maybe you notice that little spinner, but the second time it won't. So that's just something great about the way we're doing our state. It already is in memory and it's there, and it doesn't have to make that network call again. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is instead of just having the text in our detail screen like we're doing here, let's actually just have a little bit of a better UI. So I'm going to make a new file. We're just going to call it game detail.dart. So this isn't a screen, this is like the content of a game. And I'm just going to import this. Now, I've just pasted this in because there's nothing really special about this. In fact, it's just a stateless widget. There's nothing crazy here. It's just some stuff right here, and I have to rename this release here. But let's just, this is just something that's going to lay out the text. Not the most beautiful thing, but then instead we can go game detail and pass in the game itself. And now we'll have a little bit of a, not that this is beautiful at all, but we have this little bit of a, UI. As you can imagine, you can do whatever you want with this. Okay, cool. So that's all good. Let's walk through just quickly again how that is working. So from the game list tiles point of view, we're pushing to the game detail screen, and we are watching the game detail provider based on the game ID that's passed in. In the case that it's already in memory, it's already been fetched before, this will already be, data will already be non-null, and it will just instantly show that. But likely what will happen in most cases is it will start in the loading state, and then it will go to the data state, unless something went wrong. So when that's happening, we're going to get this data back, we're just calling this retrieve function right here, and it's just going to our base path with ID after it and doing the same sort of fold, passing the error back if it's an error. Otherwise, we're taking our game and getting the data and making it from JSON. And then all of that game object itself, when there is data right here, assuming it's not null, we pass the game through to our game detail, and we just render something that's working. Okay, so that's where I'm going to leave it for part 2. And part 3, what we're going to do is actually deal with modifying data, so creating new data and updating data, and if we have time, maybe even deleting. We'll see you in the next one.